Chargeback Best Practices. My name is Randy Vanderhoof. I'm the director of the U.S. Payments Forum, and I'll be moderating today's interview. If we could go to the next slide. So perhaps for many of you, this is your first opportunity to participate in a U.S. Payments Forum presentation. So let me give you a brief introduction of who we are if you're not aware. So the U.S. Payments Forum is a cross-industry body focused on supporting the introduction and implementation of EMV in the United States and other new and emerging technologies that protect the security of and enhance opportunities for payment transactions within the United States. Some of you may have heard of the EMV Migration Forum, which was established back in 2012 and has been instrumental in the progress so far in the U.S. migration to EMV chip technology. We recently rebranded and expanded the charter of the EMV Migration Forum and have now made the name change to the U.S. Payments Forum. The U.S. Payments Forum represents the full payments ecosystem in our 160-plus members, and that includes issuers, merchants, acquirers and processors, the payment networks, the debit networks, consultants, integrators, industry suppliers, and even associations to represent a broad reach of all of the parties responsible for payments across the U.S. landscape. Today's topic on chargeback best practices is a direct connection to the policies that were put in place to accelerate EMV adoption and to remove counterfeit fraud from the systems. And so if you go to the next slide, please. So the U.S. is the largest and most complex payments market to adopt EMV to date, and actually the last major global region to migrate to chip. And we've seen significant progress over the last year and the years leading up to this towards the full integration of EMV. So at present, we have over 500 million EMV chip cards that have been issued in the U.S. market, and it's estimated that 75% of consumers now have at least one card in their wallet that has a chip on it. We continue to see merchant acceptance increasing month over month. We're now over 1.7 million locations that are accepting chip transactions, and recent data that was published by Visa said that the chip-on-chip transactions, meaning an interaction where a consumer with a chip card is using that card at a chip-enabled merchant location, has increased to over 11% of all transactions. So this is really significant progress, even though we will all admit that there is still much work to be done, and progress is going to take time in order to become a full, mature market. The original goal of the EMV was to prevent card-present fraud at the retail point of sale, and that is why we have made this significant investment amongst all of the stakeholders in the market. And the goal there is to reduce counterfeit fraud at the physical point of sale. And so far, we're finding that evidence is showing that EMV is very effective in this, with a 38% decrease in counterfeit fraud at merchants that are currently accepting chip. So it is a proven technology that's worked well around the globe, and we're starting to see those effects in the U.S. market. As the number of retail acceptance locations goes up, the number of chargeback incidents will go down, and in a mature market, there will no longer be as much emphasis placed on chargeback best practices and ways to them. But until we reach maturity, both issuers and merchants will have to remain vigilant that they are following sound best practices on chargeback activity. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the discussion around chargebacks is a byproduct of the fraud liability shifts that went into effect with the announcement of EMV. And so let's take a moment and review what the fraud liability shifts mean. So fraud liability shifts have been implemented in every country that has moved to EMV with the goal of reducing counterfeit fraud by holding the least secure party in the transaction responsible for the fraud when a chip is not in use. And we've seen that the shift in responsibility under the fraud liability shift rules serves as a driver by reducing fraud and encouraging EMV migration for both the issuers and the merchants. The chip liability shift chargebacks, which are a byproduct of the fraud liability shift, is a result of the fact that the U.S. is not 100% chip enabled. And so there are still transactions occurring in the market where either the card is not chip enabled or the card is used at a merchant location that is not ready to accept chip. And there's been recent announcements related to new policies that have gone into effect dealing with the frequency and the minimum values of some of these chargebacks. And if you're interested in learning more about those, you should review the policy statements made by the various payment brands on this. This webinar's focus is going to be on the best practices for issuers, merchants, and acquirers to ensure that valid authorizations take place and to avoid the chip liability shift chargebacks whenever possible. And when there are disputes, to manage those disputes and to mitigate those chargebacks in as timely and as efficiently as possible. This webinar is based on a white paper that the U.S. Payments Forum recently published, and we encourage all of you to follow up and read that document when you have the opportunity. Next slide. So for today's webinar, we're going to have 4 other presenters besides myself. We'll have Simon Hurry with Visa, who's going to be talking about issuing best practices. He'll be followed by Stephen Cole with Vantiv, who's going to give the perspective on merchant best practices for authorization and avoiding chargebacks. Followed by Brandon Cranford from Wood Forest National Bank on the perspective of the issuer's best practices for managing disputes. And he'll be followed by Doug Whiteside from MasterCard talking about merchant best practices for disputing and mitigating chargebacks. I'll return at the end for the Q&A session, and I encourage all of you who are interested in submitting questions to do so during the presentation so that we can review the questions and sort them to the appropriate person to respond and not be inundated by lots of questions coming in right at the very end when we're trying to organize those questions and get them out to you. Also, I'd like to note that the copies of the slides will be available after the conclusion of the webinar, and you will receive an email notification with a link where you can access the content of both the slide deck as well as the audio recording of today's presentation. So now I'll turn things over to Simon Hurry from Visa with our first presenter. Simon?
Thank you, Randy. This is a great introduction. I'm not going to be addressing chargebacks per se in my section. Those will be addressed later in the panel by the other panelists. But what I am going to address and what I do need to address is how to prevent those chargebacks from happening in the first place. Next slide, please, Kathy. Sorry, I'm having a bit of a technical difficulty here. Okay, so there are 3 basic principles that we need to adhere to when we guide issuer authorizations. The first is to maintain or even strengthen risk controls on magnetic stripe transactions. And what I mean by this is simply due to the fact that as an issuer you've issued a chip card does not mean you don't still have the obligation to manage any high-risk mag stripe transactions. So there are going to be terminals out there that have not yet migrated to chip, and there are going to be issuers out there that are still on mag stripe. And as soon as there's a mag stripe transaction in place, issuers should apply the same risk management that they do today on existing magstripe transactions. However, there is an opportunity to actually relax the risk controls when you are aware that it is a chip-on-chip transaction. And that's very important because there's a very good opportunity on a chip-on-chip transaction to basically get a fairly good improvement in your approval rate. So if, for example, your cardholder is traveling outside of the US and you happen to see a magstripe transaction, traditionally that's been treated with a high degree of risk and in several cases either referred or declined. However, if you see that the transaction is chip-on-chip, that's a great opportunity to basically approve the transaction because you've removed the threat of it being counterfeit. And then lastly, there's an obligation and a requirement to actually strengthen risk controls on fallback transactions. And that's important because a fallback transaction is, in fact, a high-risk transaction. When fallback occurs, it's usually either because of cardholder or data quality error, but it can be, in some cases, as a result of a fraudster deliberately trying to tamper with the device so that the chip is damaged and the magstripe is used. Next slide, please, Kathy. I'm sorry, I am having a little bit of technical difficulty, but I'm hoping to sort that out in a minute. For some reason, it's not updating very well on my side. Okay, so what are some of these best practices that that issuers should be looking at? Well, the first is that you should always check the point-of-sale entry mode matches the product capabilities for the payment device that you've issued. Now, let me give you an example of that. If, for example, you have not yet issued a chip card, or let's say you have not issued a mobile wallet product, and you start seeing transactions coming in where the point-of-sale entry mode is indicating that this transaction emanates from a wallet, well, you know that something's wrong. If you haven't issued that product, you shouldn't see transaction types of that coming in. So that's one thing that issuers should be aware of, and it's a data quality issue, but it's certainly something that you should be checking. In addition, it's critically important to check and validate the service code as well as the card verification value, and decline any transactions with either invalid card verification values or service codes that are completely out of range of the normal service code range. You may have heard of the NCR article a few weeks back where they were claiming that you could simply change the service code on a chip card from the regular 201 to a 101 and circumvent the chip technology. Well, that's absolutely not true. The truth is the moment you alter a value on the stripe, even if it is a value on the magnetic stripe, if you alter the PAN, the expiry, or the service code, then you need to recalculate the card verification value, and that can only be done using the issuer's host key, which is very securely stored at the issuer host. So you can't simply change the service code and get around the chip technology that way. It does not work. Also, you should continue to use your risk scores to manage fraud risk. Those tools are available whether you're using AA or Falcon. You should continue to do that, and as I mentioned, you should basically keep the same scoring risk on a magstripe transaction, but obviously relax it a little bit on chip transactions. But then for fallback, as I mentioned, which is higher risk, you should actually use a risk rules engine to manage fallback. That's one of the best ways of doing it. And the type of thing that you want to look at is this card going to fallback at every merchant, or is a single merchant having a lot of fallback? Because that can give you a good idea of whether this is a data quality issue or whether it's actually a fraud attempt. So if, for example, your card has been used consistently as a chip card and then all of a sudden starts falling back, but continues to fall back time and time again, that's something that you would absolutely be alerted to and view as with a high degree of risk, because something's happened. Either the card has been tampered with, stolen and tampered with, or it is actually faulty, which is highly unlikely because the chip technology is very robust. And in that case, you'd want to contact the card holder and reissue the card, and of course, you know, have a very, very high risk score and probably decline transactions. However, if you're seeing that the card fell back at one particular merchant and then continued as chip, and if you can see that there's a lot of fallback at that merchant, it may be that they're going through a phased approach in their implementation or having some teething problems, and it could simply be data quality. So, you know, that's where you need a more sophisticated type of rules engine like Visa Risk Manager to do that sort of thing. And then, of course, you should do the regular velocity checks for uncommon usage patterns. So, for example, if you see, you know, 150 transactions at a particular merchant over a weekend, and that's very, very atypical of your cardholder, again, those velocity checks should start doing their job with respect to starting to decline transactions that are uncommon. And then lastly, of course, you know, use travel alerts or location checks as additional safeguards. These are, again, typical tools found in any risk management service. And finally, next slide, please, Kathy. You should give your cardholders some guidance and some tools of their own. And you know, cardholders don't want to see the fraud either, so encourage cardholders to set up alerts on the system, and have them advise you on overseas travel dates so that you can take extra precautions or at least approve transactions that are within those dates. And then, of course, monitor your account frequently. You don't want to wait till the end of the month to check your statement and then only then find out that, you know, there are 10 or 15 fraudulent transactions. If you can catch these early, it's much better, because obviously you can decline any further fraudulent attempts. And then, of course, lastly, if a cardholder knows that their card or mobile phone has been stolen, make sure that you encourage them to report it as quickly as possible. So those are some of the things that the issuers can and should be doing to prevent the fraud from happening in the first place. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Steve Cole, who's going to cover the same sort of thing except from the merchant side of the house. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Simon. So we're going to spend a few minutes now talking about practices that merchants can employ at the point of sale to attempt to avoid getting those chargebacks in the first place. And we're going to talk about these practices from two perspectives. One, for merchants who have not yet implemented chip processing, and then also for merchants who have implemented chip processing. Next slide, please. So obviously, merchants that have not implemented chip processing yet are at an increased risk of having counterfeit transactions performed at their locations. The criminals that perform these the fraudulent transactions are pretty good at what they do, and they quickly figure out what merchants don't have the capability to process an EMV transactions and which ones do, and they will often go and target those merchants who have not yet implemented EMV in order to perpetrate that fraud. If those transactions are coming through your system, obviously that then increases your chance that you're going to start seeing counterfeit liability shift chargebacks, which can be significant and can be quite damaging to the financial health of a merchant. While obviously the best defense against counterfeit fraud and the chargebacks that can result from that is to become EMV enabled, there are some practices that merchants who have not yet become chip-enabled can take in order to reduce that fraud at the point of sale. Next slide, please. One of the first things that a merchant can do is perform a read and compare verification. The idea here is to verify that the last 4 digits that are actually embossed or printed on the card match the last 4 digits that were read off the magnetic stripe. This can be done in a couple of different ways. The merchant can compare the value that's printed on the card against what they can see in their system. If they don't have the ability to see that within their system directly, they can also compare what's on the card versus what actually printed on the receipt, which would be what came off of the magnetic stripe, to make sure that those values are matching. Now that obviously adds a little bit of time to the checkout process, so you may not want to do this for every transaction, but there are certain scenarios where you may want to consider this as a strategy. One is where you're having high dollar transactions, right? If it's over $100, $150, whatever that limit is, whatever you have that threshold set at, anything above that you would perform this check. You might also do it based on the type of items that are purchased, right? So if the cardholder is buying a handful of gift cards, that might be a trigger to say that you would want to perform this check to make sure that those are matching. And then finally, based on your particular business, your customer base, you may notice certain cardholders are behaving in ways that are not consistent with your typical cardholder, which may raise suspicions of what they're trying to accomplish, and you may want to verify the card against the receipt in that scenario as well. Next slide, please. Merchants can also, in some cases, check the cardholder's ID to make sure that the name on the payment card matches the name on the ID. One thing about this is you need to be aware that some networks do not allow ID checks as a condition of sale, so you need to understand what the rules are around that before implementing this type of a check. Merchants can also perform velocity checks just as the issuers can, as Simon mentioned, which can highlight excessive transaction activity. You may see a particular card being used repeatedly at the same location over and over. Simon mentioned, what about that card that was used 100 times over the weekend, at a single location? That could obviously indicate somebody has found a weak spot and is trying to exploit that all that they can. Obviously, velocity checks require some system support. It's not something you can really manually do, so it's probably something a bigger merchant would look at employing. And these velocity checks also may not, 100% of the time indicate there's fraud, but they could be used to trigger additional verification steps when a particular card is being identified as being used excessively. Next slide, please. Beyond those strategies, merchants can also implement some process-oriented strategies to try and reduce their exposure to these types of transactions. And it just goes back to identifying particular types of goods and services that might be attractive to these fraudsters. Gift cards, we all know that that's an attractive target. High dollar. Electronics could be another one, or it could be locations where maybe you have a lot of international traffic and tourist traffic where you may see more counterfeit fraud than you would in other areas. And then when you identify that population of locations or goods that you want to monitor, implement procedures to address those targets. So you might have a scenario where you have a manager that needs to process gift card transactions over a specific dollar amount, or maybe you would contact the issuer to approve specific high-risk transactions. So those are the types of things you can take once you've identified the goods and services that you feel may be most at risk from that type of fraud. And in addition to that, merchants should also look at implementing PIN prompting for debit transactions. having the ability to capture a knowledge-based verification method can reduce that counterfeit fraud at the point of sale if that bad guy doesn't know what the PIN for that particular card is. So if you do implement PIN at your locations, you need to be wary of anybody who's trying to do PIN bypass. If you allow that, that's above your no CVM limit or your no signature limit, right? So if they're trying to get around entering their PIN and they're trying to buy $300 worth of gift cards, that might be something that you should be a little bit suspicious of. Next slide, please. So those are some strategies that merchants that have not enabled for chip processing can take, but we're also going to look at strategies that merchants that are chip enabled can take. And you might think, well, wait, if I'm chip enabled, why would I ever get a chargeback? Well, there are some scenarios that you need to be aware of and make sure you handle them correctly. And if you do handle them correctly, you won't see those chargebacks, but you potentially could if you don't do things the right way. So the first is around fallback. Simon mentioned fallback earlier, and the process there is the card's inserted. The chip card is inserted into a chip card reader, but for some reason the terminal can't read the chip. Generally, you're going to want to ask that cardholder to insert the card one more time. They may have put it in upside down or backwards or something. But if the chip truly can't be read, then the terminal will prompt the cardholder to remove the card and swipe it, and that's what is known as technical fallback. And when that's done correctly, the merchant is still protected from any liability shift, but they got to make sure that they are indicating that is fallback based on the values that they're sending up in the message. So if they don't send the correct values to indicate that fallback was performed, that could result in a chargeback coming back, even though it was a fallback transaction. You must also make sure that you're not misidentifying transactions as fallback that are not fallback. That can be a compliance issue as well. And the white paper that Randy mentioned earlier, on which this webinar is based, has a list of critical values for several of the networks. So I certainly encourage you to download the white paper and read through that so you're familiar with what those data elements are that you need to be especially mindful of. In addition to that, merchants, even once you're chip enabled, you might want to look at PIN support, implementing PIN. Some of the networks do have a lost and stolen liability shift, and in that scenario, merchants would be encouraged to certify online PIN and offline PIN for both debit and credit transactions, because you now can see all of these different scenarios of PIN and seeing it on both credit and debit. But certainly at a minimum, you'd want to consider supporting online PIN for debit transactions, as that's the most common form of PIN in the United States at this point anyway. Next slide, please. And then finally, merchants that are chip enabled also want to make sure that they've got good data quality. This can also lead to issues around chargebacks that shouldn't come through simply because the data that you were sending up in the transaction didn't truly represent what was happening at the point of sale. Again, you know, not identifying fallback properly can do that. Having data in your authorization message that doesn't match what goes up in your clearing message, that can create some issues too. So it's very important to make sure that not only do you capture the data correctly and populate the data fields correctly, but that information flows through your systems correctly so that everything is in sync with each other. All right, so next slide, Kathy. So now we're going to hand it over to Brandon Cranford from Woodford National Bank, who's going to talk about some more issuer best practices.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Good commentary from the panelists so far. I'm going to speak today regarding the issuer best practices for chargebacks and give some indications of what's working and what we're seeing out in the industry. Next slide, please. To keep mine very specific and in general to what's happening, understanding the liability shift is key. For any issuer, despite what phase of chip enablement you are in with your portfolio, whether you're still full mag, contemplating on which direction to go in the process or already transitioned, understanding the liability shifts from a chargeback perspective is key. It's important to know the rules that are established by each specific network. Need to be very clear on your liability rights as it relates to chip and PIN, chip and signature profiles, what constitutes a lost stolen liability shift if the network supports that, as well as fallback transactions, and understanding your rights or lack thereof as it relates to each of those type of structures on your portfolio. Another key component of the liability shift is know that there's multiple phases to that. It wasn't once and done previously. So there is another update coming in October as it relates to domestic ATMs. It's very important that issuers are aware of this and their systems are calibrated and structured properly to identify those transactions when customers initiate disputes, how you want to handle those. Make sure your procedures are also updated so that you know how to address those from a chargeback perspective. And another phase of the liability shift, as it is pay at the pump. 5542 merchant category code as that comes around in 2017. Also a great opportunity to make sure your systems, procedures, and processes, whether internally or with your processor, are updated to ensure that you are able to handle those and react to those customer claims appropriately. Another key component is being able to avoid ineligible chargebacks. One thing that I think everyone wants in the ecosystem is integrity, and that starts all the way from authorization, processing, fraud mitigation, but chargebacks is no different. You want to be able to use the data to drive your decisions. The data in the specification in the ISO will tell you what type of transactions are being performed by your customers, whether magstripe or chip-enabled, contactless, etc. You'll use the transaction to determine what your chargeback rights are. You can't just use a blanket statement that my customer's card has a chip on it, therefore I have a chargeback in some form. That's not accurate. Make sure you're understanding the liability shift, what your personalization profiles are, and what type of transactions are being presented. Some of those specific elements that are very important are your service codes, your merchant category types, as not all are eligible for the liability shift at this point, your PAN and terminal entry modes, card present indicators, etc. Issuers need to be very familiar with those data points that are important to understanding what chargeback rights exist and which codes are eligible for those. Knowing how to tell if a transaction is a fallback transaction is very important. You've heard that mentioned by each panelist so far. Everyone in the industry is watching fallback rates. Fallback rates indicate there could be a problem with your structure of your chip, could be a merchant issue or fraud attempts. Make sure you know your rights as it relates to a fallback on your chip-enabled program. You shouldn't experience fallback if you're still in the magstripe program phase and haven't migrated or begun that process to chip enablement. So if you are chip-enabled, managing fallback from a risk standpoint is very important to helping eliminate the need for chargebacks. Lastly, the key for most issuers to be successful post their EMV enablement is to maintain your existing processes. Authorizations are key. The primary goal of most issuers is to ensure that our customers are not inconvenienced at the terminal. We have high approval rates. We have strong fraud mitigation to prevent loss, and that we're able to service our customers when they do have a legitimate chargeback. That doesn't change. As Simon mentioned, there may be some lacks from a fraud mitigation on those issuers who are already migrated to chip. All I can say is watch your volumes, know your customer, understand what merchant bases and categories have not yet migrated to chip. That'll give you some idea on your fraud mitigation strategies on how you want to handle those. Make sure you're monitoring velocities, invalid cryptograms, and replay fraud attacks. Keep an eye out on high percentages of fallbacks. As Simon and others mentioned, validate your service restriction codes. Those are very important. And lastly, if you're a contact-only program, you shouldn't be seeing contactless transactions. Keep those fraud mitigation strategies important. It's everyone's responsibility to control that, from the customer to the merchant to the issuer. And lastly, as it relates to chargebacks, as I mentioned before, integrity is key. What integrity does is it allows issuers and merchants to work in the same space for the common goal, and it also limits the need for networks to stand in and put in rules and processes that kind of limit the functionality and availability of those chargebacks. Make sure whenever you're going through your chargeback process that nothing on the front side has changed. Just because you're a chip-enabled transaction doesn't give certain rights or take away certain rights from the initial process of filing a chargeback. Your customer has that right and you want to support them. Chargebacks for liability shift or otherwise should generally and only be submitted when it's a customer-initiated dispute. Another first upfront part of your investigation is determine, was this claim a counterfeit claim or was it a lost stolen claim on behalf of the customer? That will often dictate, based on your network, what your liability is regarding that transaction, what chargeback rights you have. And continue your standard investigations. Even though a transaction may be eligible for a liability shift, it's incumbent upon the issuer to do their investigation process, make sure it's a viable claim, do the best you can to support your customer, and then you make the right decision. That's all part of making sure there's integrity in the ecosystem as it relates to chargebacks. And lastly, I'll mention, check the white paper for the best practices as it relates to authorization processing, fraud mitigation, which is your first step to eliminating the volume of chargebacks that are being kind of seen in the industry, and then how issuers should handle chargebacks and the integrity around that process. That white paper will give some good best practices and guidance for issuers on how to handle this. Can you advance the slide, please? And with that, I'll hand it over to Doug at MasterCard to discuss merchant best practices for managing disputes and chargebacks from that perspective.
Thank you, Brandon, and my fellow panelists. What I would like to do is talk about once a chargeback is received from the merchant and acquirer perspective in terms of the best practices for managing those disputes and helping managing those chargebacks. Can you go ahead and go to the next slide? So the first thing I'd like to talk about is really any time within the industry that chargeback reason codes are changed or new liability shifts or chargeback rule changes are introduced into the industry. There is, of course, a learning curve that has to occur on the issuing side and the acquiring merchant side as it relates to how do I administer those chargeback rights and those liability shifts, and then what type of representment rights do we have associated with those. And of course, we've seen that with the chip liability shift, both in terms of initially some invalid chargebacks and also invalid representment activity. With that, the key here is two things. Many merchants, of course, have deployed chip terminals in stages across different regions or different states or different cities or on different terminals. One location may be operating a magnetic stripe terminal while another is moved on to chip terminals. The importance here that anytime that you're receiving a chargeback, that the data in the authorization, the information in the authorization for that individual transaction is really what you need to use to determine the validity of that chip liability shift chargeback. Authorization information across the networks really rule the day from a standpoint on where is the chargeback rights and where are the representment rights, and if the dispute would continue into an arbitration or compliance cycle. Authorization information is really the data that is used to determine the applicability of the chip liability shift and the chargeback associated with it. A key component, of course, is valid and invalid representments. Just like invalid chargebacks, invalid representments are both costly to the acquirer and issuer. And anytime you're receiving a chargeback, interrogating the authorization, interrogating the transaction, and determine the validity of that chargeback, and then the validity of your representment rights is going to be critical as you migrate to chip and then maintain a full chip environment from a point of sale perspective. Next slide, please. One thing that we wanted to do, of course, is to give you the key data points, and these are the minimum data points that merchants and acquirers should be maintaining in order to evaluate the validity of a chargeback and then the validity of a representment. For counterfeit fraud, the key components that you should be looking at are the point of sale entry mode, the service code, which indicates the type of card that's involved in the transaction, the issuer approval code, the terminal entry capability, the attended terminal status, and then, of course, as my colleagues have said prior, the evidence that the chip data in field 55 was actually sent and sent properly. Now, a key point here is this relevant data can vary by payment network, and where the data may reside in the message may also vary by payment network. What we encourage you to do is contact your acquirer or the individual network, right, for more information on network-specific message formats and data as it relates to these minimum key data points. For lost stolen related chargebacks, very similar information as the main minimum data points with the addition of really PIN and the status of PIN and the status of CVR and TVR involved with that transaction. So for lost stolen, point of sale entry mode, service code, the issuer approval code again, terminal entry capability and attended terminal status, and then of course the evidence of chip data, data element 55 or field 55 that it was sent properly. And then the other key components are terminal pin pad status within the data element 55 within the chip data, the terminal verification results or the TVR, the card verification results or the CVR, and the POS pin entry mode. These are the minimum data key data points that you should be maintaining to interrogate the validity of chargebacks and the validity of your representment rights. Please go to the next page. On the next few slides, I'd like to talk about really just valid reasons why an acquirer or merchant may have a representment on a chip liability shift chargeback. This list is not fully inclusive. It's not limited to all the following, but these are the key ones. The first one would be invalid documentation on behalf of the issuer that's submitting the chargeback. So for example, where it was referenced earlier in the webinar here, the cardholder fails to state that the card is in their possession, and that would be for a counterfeit related chip liability shift, or the card was lost and stolen as part of the chip and PIN chip liability shift, and that the card was not in their possession. Now, these are applicable if the network requires this information to be provided to the acquirer, but that is one of the first checks that you as a merchant and acquirer and representment rights should be looking is, what is the type of chip liability shift being applied, counterfeit or lost stolen, and is the cardholder claiming that they have or don't have their card in proper atonement with what the claim is. The next piece of that, on the second bullet point, is was the transaction properly reported to the brand or network chargeback requirements? So if the issuer fails to report the chargeback properly, and properly as fraud according to the brand or network rules, you may have a representment right purely based on the fact that it was not properly reported to the brand or network. The third bullet point relates back to service code, where we were referring earlier to the key data points. For a chip liability shift chargeback, within the service code, the value should equal 2XX or CXX. If the value does not equal those two values within the authorization and within the chargeback, the chip liability shift chargeback may be invalid, and you may have a second representment right purely based on that value in the service code being incorrect. You commonly would see this is if an issuer has a magnetic stripe card and for some reason is trying to charge it back for chip liability shift to a terminal that is a chip terminal. And of course you would have a representment right in those cases. Next slide, please. Another one, as discussed earlier, would be for automated fuel dispensers, or AFD. If you're receiving chargebacks for AFD, they are, across most brands, invalid until the October 2017 liability date. So if you're receiving those, interrogating the MCC, interrogating the transaction type, is going to help you determine a potential representment right. That's going to also apply to that second bullet point on this page for contactless transactions. Looking at that point of sale entry mode and the transaction type and the MCC if it's a contactless transaction shown in the authorization, generally indicated by the POS entry mode for that respective brand or network. Issuers do not have chargeback rights on those, and you would have a representment right on a chip-to-chip chargeback that's a contactless transaction that the issuer is trying to forward a chargeback over. Also, if the authorization data confirms that the card and the terminal were EMV enabled and that the valid data supports proper processing of such, you may have a representment right in those cases. A common one that's going to be involved here, of course, is the prior example where it's a magstripe card at a chip terminal, and for whatever reason the issuer may be trying to mistakenly use a chip liability shift chargeback. And even probably more relevant here is that proper fallback situation that Brandon mentioned earlier, right? Where for whatever reason the chip card doesn't get read, it's at a chip terminal, the transaction processes as a properly coded fallback transaction where an issuer normally would not have a chargeback right. Looking at those authorization data components on the card, the terminal, and the point of sale entry mode is going to help determine if you have a representment right for that chargeback. And then lastly is relating to lost stolen, and this is if the authorization data confirms that the EMV terminal supports both online and offline PIN, and that the terminal PIN pad was operating properly at the time of the transaction. So if you're a merchant that's a chip merchant that is accepting PIN and you're supporting both online and offline PIN, and you're receiving a chip liability shift chargeback, and as long as your terminal PIN pad was working properly at the time of that transaction, you very potentially have a valid representment right on that potential chargeback. Next slide, please. I want to thank everyone for their time, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Randy for conclusions.
Well, thank you, Doug, and thank you all of our presenters today. I realize we submitted an awful lot of information to you in a very short period of time, and perhaps some of you were more familiar with the terminology and the discussion than others, so hopefully this is a starting point, not an end point for you in terms of understanding chargebacks, and I would encourage you again to visit the emvconnections.com website and look for the white paper called EMV Chargeback Best Practices, and review that document in its whole, and I think you will find it extremely valuable. So next slide, Kathy. So kind of a couple of final points I'd like to share with everyone regarding today's webinar. First is that many chargebacks that result from fraud that were already in the system but was not visible to many of the stakeholders, as issuers have historically absorbed this fraud in the face-to-face environment. So we're dealing with a volume of chargebacks on the merchant processor side were unfamiliar with before, partly because that these were never presented in the past and issuers had absorbed them. So that's an important factor in terms of managing the volume of chargebacks that are showing up in systems today. The second point is that avoiding chargebacks hinges on the transaction authorization process and the data integrity of the payment data that's being submitted. So the issues surrounding liability shift chargebacks and representments that were discussed are somewhat complex and all hinge on the authorization process and data integrity of the transactions. Most acquirer merchant disputes of chargebacks are resolved between the issuer and the acquirer merchant. Where agreement cannot be reached, the final resolution rests with the network responsible for processing the transaction. In addition, data and the evidence specific to each chargeback may be necessary to determine the final outcome in the dispute process. The white paper presents guidelines to avoid the issuance of invalid chip liability shift chargebacks, or in the event of a chip liability shift chargeback has been issued, the best practices to mitigate against any invalid liability shift chargebacks. And finally, chargebacks and card-present disputes are expected to decrease over time. As issuer and merchant chip implementations become more robust and data quality improves, the occurrence of invalid chip liability shift chargebacks is expected to decrease. More importantly, as the U.S. EMV migration progresses, the number of card-present disputes is expected to drop off as counterfeit fraud is reduced by EMV implementation. This is the ultimate goal of the U.S. migration to EMV, and one which issuers, merchants, networks, and acquirers can all agree on. So thank you again for your content. We do have a few minutes left, and we'll go through the questions that we received. I've been reviewing the questions and trying to sort them by priorities. We're not going to get to all of the questions today, but hopefully some of these questions that were asked multiple times can be addressed by our presenters. So I'll throw this one out to anyone who wants to try answering it. Can banks, and specifically card issuers, send through EMV fraud disputes based on the merchant not having a chip reader? The dispute is not initiated by the cardholder. I think somebody had mentioned that in their presentation, but maybe you can review that position.
Randy, hi, this is Brandon from the issuer standpoint. In the white paper, it specifically addresses the ability to use the chip liability shift codes for chargebacks that are customer initiated only. It's part of the integrity of the process from issuers to merchants and the networks is to ensure that we're utilizing those chargeback codes as it relates to the liability shift, not from an auto-generated standpoint, but when your customer initiates a legitimate claim, those are the opportunities of which you will engage and use those chargeback liability codes, not necessarily from when the institution identifies these without the cardholder's initiation to submit these chargebacks.
Okay, thank you. Another question, if a cardholder claims a stolen credit card, who is liable for it, the issuer or the merchant accepting it?
Randy, I'll start on that and just say it depends. The various brands and networks have different rules. From Visa's perspective, strictly speaking for Visa, the issuer is liable for lost stolen fraud. And I'll hand off to Doug to comment from the other brands.
From a MasterCard perspective, it's just going to depend on the nature of the dispute. I mean, if it is a lost stolen claim and the proper documentation on the transaction is presented in the chargeback, then the merchant very well may have liability for that chargeback depending upon how the transaction was processed from a chip-to-chip and PIN perspective.
Thanks, Doug. And maybe you can take this question, since we seem to have a lot of merchants on the call today that are questioning the difference between card-present transactions and card-not-present transactions. This question was, what can merchants do when it comes to chip cards being used in a keyed-in situation when taking payment over the phone or over the internet?
Well, let me start by saying card not present, if it's true card not present, is a very different kettle of fish. However, if you're in the environment where the card and the cardholder are present, then the transaction should not be keyed in. Basically, it should be, the chip should be inserted. If the chip, in the unlikely event that the chip is not working, the card should be swiped. And if the mag stripe is also not working, you know, at this point, you're looking at something highly suspicious, and I would not go to key entry at that point. So I'm not sure if that's the question that's being asked. If you are doing a key enter and you do have a terminal present, that's a different type of transaction, and we'd encourage to get some type of device where you can actually read the card and the chip instead of entering it, doing a manual key entry on it.
Okay, thank you, Simon. This next question is about fallback, And so I forget now whose presentation was covering the discussion around excessive fallbacks, but what are the specific parameters that are used in looking to determine if there has been an excessive amount of fallback transactions?
Again, I'll start on this one. We just have a threshold, basically. We know globally what fallback rates look like, and they're very, very low. And if the fallback rates exceed the threshold, which is typically under 2%, then that's deemed excessive. Again, the technology is very robust. There is no good reason for fallback unless there are significant data quality issues at play.
And Randy, this is Steve Cole from Vanderbilt. Just to weigh in, if they were also curious as far as what data elements they need to be particularly aware of in regard to a fallback. It's going to be the POS entry mode, the terminal entry capability, and then the service code from the card itself. Those are the key elements in determining whether a particular transaction was a fallback transaction, or if it was a standard magnetic stripe transaction, or if it in fact was a chip transaction.
Yeah, and this is Doug from MasterCard. From a MasterCard perspective, that's great information from my colleagues. And then from a MasterCard, we're basically looking at those data elements and monitoring fallback as a percentage of their chip transactions. And then what we do in those cases in terms of fallback concerns is that we would reach out to those particular merchants, acquirers, to investigate what the situation may be with those fallback transactions. We're monitoring to a threshold, and from a MasterCard perspective, the good news is in the U.S., at least since we started the chip liability shift, the fallback rates have been lower than what we've seen in other regions when they migrated to chip.
Great, thank you, Simon, Steve, and Doug on that. Last question I have, because we're running out of time. This one's for Steve. If a merchant has a device that is enabled for EMV processing, why would they ever get a liability chargeback?
So again, that goes back to a topic that a number of us had touched on through this webinar, and it's data quality. It's ensuring that you're properly populating the message out to the issuer so that the transaction is truly reflecting what it is. If it is a chip transaction, that's being reflected correctly based on the data. If it's a properly conducted fallback transaction, that's what's being reflected in the data. Where we've seen issues is when the data coming up in the authorization is indicating it was a magnetic stripe only capable device, but in maybe declaring it said it was a chip capable device. As we go back to the authorization as the key to this, you just got to ensure that your data is correct so that you don't get these, I guess, false positives is what you could call them.
Great, thank you, Steve. And again, sorry we weren't able to get to more of your questions, but in conclusion, if we can go to the next slide, many of you are wondering about the white paper and its availability, and so the white paper that we're speaking of is called EMV Chargeback Best Practices. It can be found on the EMV Resources website called www.emv-connection.com. And in addition to that paper, there's other very good documents there. I would encourage you to review minimum EMV chip card and terminal requirements, understanding the 2015 U.S. fraud liability shifts, and other videos, webinars, and educational workshops, all made available free of charge to the industry by the members of the U.S. Payments Forum, formerly the EMV Migration Forum. If you'd like more information about the U.S. Payments Forum, please visit our website, which is uspaymentsforum.org, and note that we will be meeting as our meeting would be in Chicago in 2 weeks, September 20th and 21st, and you're welcome to sign up and become a member and participate in those meetings. So again, I just want to finally say thank you again to Simon Hurry, Stephen Cole, Brandon Crawford, Doug Whiteside, and for your great contributions to this workshop and to the white paper. And to our audience, we thank you for participating with us today, and we hope to serve you again in the future. Enjoy the rest of your day.